Everyone, I would like to present our paper with my colleague from the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, and the usual disclaimer applies. Our position is not necessarily reflect the official position of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. And our paper is about level productivity trends, and we analyze whether the decline in productivity growth is heterogeneous, and whether the gap between leaders and laggards in terms of productivity in Russian industries increases or decreases. We define labor productivity as value added to number of employees. From literature, we know that even in narrowly defined industries, productivity is highly heterogeneous. And it is well known fact that productivity growth rate is positively correlated with the gap to productivity frontier. But despite this fact, the gap between leaders and laggards remains high. We confirm these results for Russian industries, and we conclude that despite the fast growth of productivity laggards, the gap remains high, and we check our results applying stochastic frontier models. We use data from Ruslana database. We use such variables as revenue, fixed assets, number of employees, cost of sales, labor costs, and date of incorporation. We define value added as revenue minus cost of sale plus labor costs, and define labor productivity as value added divided by number of employees. We focus our analysis on data from 2011 to 2016, and we exclude some sectors from our analysis, for example, agriculture, construction, financial services, and public sector, because estimation of productivity and the production function for these sectors are different from the rest of the sectors, and we should employ a specific technique for that. We also exclude firms with employees number less than 10, and we have in our sample about on average 25% of employees reported by Росстат, and the distribution across our selected sectors is very similar to the distribution across the sectors reported by Росстат. We divide our sample into 173 industries, and we estimate productivity, frontier, and production functions within these narrowly defined industries. We begin with two concepts of convergence. The first one is beta convergence, and the second one is sigma convergence. They are not the same. Beta convergence is necessary but not sufficient condition for sigma convergence. It means if we find beta convergence, it doesn't mean anything about sigma convergence. What are the differences between these two concepts? Beta convergence is found when laggards, in terms of productivity, grow faster than leaders. And because we focus on productivity growth, we focus only on those establishments which are present in our sample for 2 consecutive years. That's why we have survival bias. And this type of convergence is sensitive to permutation. It means if there are two firms with a low and a high productivity, and then they switch their positions, low productive becomes high productive, and vice versa. From the point of view of beta convergence, we find convergence. And sigma convergence is the other concept of convergence. They say that we find sigma convergence if some indicators of dispersion of the distribution of, for example, productivity declines. And we focus on all establishments in our sample. We do not exclude any establishments. And this concept is not sensitive to permutations. Before we start with beta convergence, I would like to show you how labor productivity growth varies with some variables. For example, we can see that 2015 was the worst year in our sample in terms of productivity growth. And firms from mining and quarrying were the most successful in terms of productivity growth, and firms from retail and wholesale trade sector was the least successful in terms of productivity growth. We can show that soon after the birth of a new firm, its productivity grows very rapidly. But this enormous growth declines soon after several years. We can show that large firms were less vulnerable to 2015 shock than small firms. In order to estimate beta convergence, we run simple regression of labor productivity growth on gap to productivity frontier in previous year and some controls. Productivity frontier was estimated as mean average productivity among 10% of the most productive firms in each 173 industry. And controls include sector, year, size, and age. We check, we find that low productive firm, initially low productive firm with a large gap to the frontier grow faster than those firms with a small gap to the frontier. And this result is very robust to different specifications, including those specifications where we estimate multi-factor productivity instead of labor productivity. And this result holds also in all sectors and during all years in our sample. But what is interesting is that productivity convergence coefficient declines as firm ages. As a result, as from ages, the number of years which is required to converge to the half of the frontier increases. That's why we can conclude that this catching up impulse is mostly driven by young firms, and soon after their birth, this impulse dies out. So we also proceed with sigma convergence. We estimate 90 to 10 ratio, and we show that this gap is higher than those reported for some countries in the literature, and this gap is increasing during our sample period, and this gap was high in 2016 than in 2011 in most industries among 173 industries in our sample. So we can conclude that this fast growth of productivity laggards is not sufficient for declining gap. So the gap is, despite this fast growth of laggards, is widening up. In order to check this result, we estimate stochastic frontier models. We assume that firms cannot optimize, and there is some technological production frontier and inefficiency term. For production frontier, we estimate translog specification, and for inefficiency term, we have two different specifications. One assumes that inefficiency term increases or decreases smoothly over time, and the second specification allows for fluctuation as we introduce some dummy variables. This type of models allow us to estimate multi-factor productivity growth, and this multi-factor productivity growth is close to labor productivity growth estimated previously. According to our first specification, 139 industries out of 179 industries is characterized by divergence. That means that the inefficiency term increases, the gap during our sample period increases. And according to our second specification, in 97 industries out of 171 industries, we find that the gap in 2016 was higher than in 2011. And only in 10 industries, the gap was lower. So we can conclude that productivity is highly heterogeneous even in very narrowly defined industries. And in almost all studies concerning level of productivity and its growth, beta convergence is found. Still, the gap is between leaders and laggards in terms of productivity is high. We confirm that in the Russian industries, productivity laggards grow faster than leaders, but it's mostly driven by young firms, and soon after their birth, this impulse dies out. This catching up impulse is not sufficient for decreasing productivity gap. It is higher than in some industries or some countries reported in literature, and it is still increasing. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. The discussant is Marshall Reinsdorf.
Well, I usually. Oh, thank you, Andrew. I guess I would have noticed eventually.
A different slide. This one.
No, that's for the later this afternoon.
Yes.
There's a morning lecture one. Productivity trends. Yes, that's today, or to this morning, I should say.
Okay.
Okay. Very good. You know, I usually spend a lot of time going over the paper to highlight the main points, but the author did such an excellent job, you might find it boring to hear it twice. Anyway, I prepared in advance. So give a little background for the paper. You know, we have a global productivity slowdown, which is also seen here in Russia. There's a long literature on causes of the slowdown. Some people think it's partly mismeasurement. Maybe it's not as bad as we think. But among those who think it's real, there's several papers that find sort of divergence or heterogeneity getting worse has contributed to the slowdown. So in other words, the frontier firm productivity is still growing pretty fast, but the gap between the average firm and the frontier firm is getting wider, and the aggregate numbers reflect the average, not the frontier. So therefore, the dispersion question becomes really important in understanding the productivity slowdown. So that's a little bit of a background for why you should be interested in the topic of this particular paper. The other thing they talk about is, there's less dynamism, maybe less new firms starting up and growing, and that slowed it down a little bit. Less movement of factors of production. So this paper is going to take a look at some micro evidence in Russia on divergences in productivity, dispersion of productivity across firms. So they have this Ruslana database with microdata on individual firms in Russia. These are the industries they use. You can see mining, manufacturing, utilities, wholesale, retail, and so on. They give you a little bit of data to show you that their sample is not entirely representative of the population of firms within those industries. And they focus on value added as a measure of output. Although personally, I like to use gross output for multi-factor and value added for labor productivity, but they want the same throughout. So the first approach to ask, is there convergence? In other words, do we have a situation where the laggards are catching up and the gap, the dispersion is collapsing, getting smaller? If we had convergence, that would presumably be good for productivity growth. Beta convergence is effectively asking, how big is the gap between your firm and the frontier when you start? And do the firms that start the furthest behind tend to have faster growth? One thing you could think about with this beta model is, if beta was really high, you would have a bouncing effect. So beta being the coefficient on the gap, right? If it's too high, you just bounce around a little bit. So it's not really monotonically related to convergence, but maybe we think we'll never get to beta equal 2, so we don't worry about that. I wanted to highlight age. I see the author in your presentation, you highlighted age as a factor. I think more than was in the paper, but age is actually very important. Young firms do start out looking really bad and then they grow pretty fast. I think really with a young firm, they usually have a lot of investment in starting up their business, and that's not properly recorded in their output, so they look less productive than they really are because of the time lag between their investments that they're making and when they're going to pay off. So here's two approaches. You could see the pooled approach. You have a positive coefficient in the 0.8 range, and you put fixed effects, so you do within the firm, it jumps to 0.66. So big impacts on beta convergence. Sigma convergence just asks, is the cross-sectional variation shrinking or not? And effectively what they found is it's not, it's actually getting wider. So one thing about the sigma is you can include in that all the firms that exit and enter, everybody's in there, whereas the beta convergence, you have to be a survivor. So this maybe shows the effects of the entrance. But in my opinion, it's a more direct measure of what we really care about. So finally, they look at the stochastic frontier approach, where they say, okay, let's use the entire time period to measure what they call a firm's efficiency. So an inefficient firm is one that has, on average, a far gap from the frontier of their industry, or it turns out as their sector. And this is, I think, a better way to identify sort of gap effects. How far behind are you? It's a little bit less biased towards finding a positive impact. And sure enough, when they do the stochastic frontier approach, they do not find convergence. They find falling productivity. I don't know if I can point here. You can see falling productivity. There's two versions of stochastic here. The one that bounces around is the flexible version, and the one that's a straight line, they kind of constrain it to have a straight trend. But you could see either way, you got a bit of a downward trend. The author showed you the divergence results are more common than the convergence. So let me now turn to a few comments after a reminder of what the paper was about. One thing I would say, it's not on the slide here, the value added is measured by taking cost of goods sold plus labor compensation, which is not the sort of standard way I think of it as, total revenue minus cost of intermediate inputs. I assume cost of goods sold was a proxy for maybe returns to capital. So you're adding profits to capital plus profits to labor and calling it value added, but it might be nice to link the way you calculated it to the way it's standard definition. I think there's maybe, the beta convergence, I never expected them to give the right answer. You almost always find a positive beta. It doesn't prove much in my opinion, so I might just sort of pass on to more interesting analyses a little quicker. But the frontier was a very nice job of showing how you could really detect divergence in a more, I think, believable way. The other thing, you do mention you're forced to pool all the firms within a sector, and you say, well, that's a strong assumption that they all share the same technology, but there's no choice. It is a strong assumption. I don't know if you can explore it at all, like some sensitivity to the assumption. I understand there's no alternative to it. And then another comment, there's an equation in the paper that I liked, decomposing the growth in multi-factor productivity into technical progress, which would be the advance in the frontier. How fast is the frontier productivity growing? Plus a kind of change in the average technical efficiency. So this is a kind of gap between the average firm and the frontier firm. And then there was a third term called a reallocation effect, where capital and labor were moving between high productivity and low productivity firms. So the equation was nice, but it wasn't really followed up on with any numbers. So I think it would be interesting to follow up on that equation a little bit more and show us how you could estimate those three components, assuming it's possible. And another comment I could make is, the aggregate really depends on the difference between the frontier and the average. I'd really like to know what's the impact on the aggregate, which is what I care about, of the changes in the distribution. And finally, at the beginning, you showed that your sample was not really representative or diverged. You could treat it as a stratified sample, reweight a little bit to try to get it closer to representative and see if that changes the results. Probably it won't, but it would certainly be a useful way of following up on an open question that was raised at the beginning of the paper. So I think I'm almost out of time, and I'm at the end of my presentation.